Thanks for tuning in for the 4 o'clock news and politics show. 3 o'clock was Ava Gaudette. Great lineup. If you didn't check it out, be sure to do so. But lots going on politically down in D.C. And as we do most Tuesdays, check in with Jennifer Lawless at American University. Jennifer, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
We are great up here, but all the action is happening inside the Beltway literally as we speak. And of course, tonight, the State of the Union, all eyes will be on the president. But before we even get to that, with things that have happened over the past couple of days and the FBI being in such focus, just kind of wanted to run down what the talk is, what the perception is in DC, in this confidential House GOP memo that appears could be declassified. What could potentially be the implications here?
Well, the reason that the committee wants the memo declassified and they want the Trump administration to release it is because they're alleging that based on the investigation, they found that the FBI was not forthcoming in its investigation, not only into Hillary Clinton, but into Russia. And instead, they relied on questionable intelligence, including pieces of the Steele dossier, to assemble evidence to suggest whether it be obstruction of justice or collusion or whatever else. Now, the Democrats are saying that they've cherry-picked and hand-picked pieces of evidence that are blatantly not true, that Devin Nunes, who's the chair of the committee who decided to release the memo, didn't even read the classified intelligence, instead a staffer did. And that because they're following the rules, the Democrats that is, they're in a position where they can't respond in detail to this memo because doing so would actually result in sharing classified information. So the Democrats are stuck between a rock and a hard place. But the reality is that regardless of what happens, the Trump Justice Department has said that it would be extraordinarily reckless to release this memo. So the Democrats and the Republicans might be playing politics over this, but the Justice Department thinks that there are
Contents of this memo.
I think we will, because I don't think that Donald Trump understands the broader issues at stake. I think to him, it's just evidence that there's nothing going on with Russia. And, you know, if you believe the Democrats, then that's actually not the case at all. The question here is just where did some of the information and where did the intelligence come from?
They might want to take a step back before actually knowing exactly what is. Do you think we'll see the contents of this memo?
I think we will, because I don't think that Donald Trump understands the broader issues at stake. I think to him, it's just evidence that there's nothing going on with Russia. And, you know, if you believe the Democrats, then that's actually not the case at all. The question here is just where did some of the information and where did the intelligence come from? It's not necessarily that there's new information about what Trump did or didn't do, but he's been so clear about wanting to prove that this entire investigation is politically motivated. You know, that I think he will release it. Now, the one other thing I will note here is that the Democrats eventually will release their response. They're just going through all of the channels to make sure that it's redacted and declassified and everything else, which means that the Republicans will basically have control over the narrative from the time that they release the memo for probably 72 hours. But at that point, the Democrats will have a chance to hit back.
Do you think that we will, as you pointed out to the perception in the international community about intelligence gathering and if this is made public, do you think that we would see a response from the international community on this? You know, we just saw Trump at Davos, by all intents and purposes, just seems like a good trip for the president, but could this put him in, and would we see that type of reaction, a perilous situation in the international community?
I mean, I think it's possible. And as far as Davos is concerned, remember that was, I mean, it's a bunch of rich people, right? Like, that's Trump's constituency. And he still managed in Switzerland, where they're generally very neutral, right? So, I mean, he managed even to offend people there by, you know, making cracks at the media. So, you know, I'm not sure that that's the litmus test we should be using to determine whether other heads of state and the international community will respect the decisions that the president makes. But, you know, I certainly think that he's jeopardized if he releases the memo, he'll have jeopardized sort of international security and norms in a way that it might be still too soon to tell what that will, you know, how that will result.
And what of the resignation of McCabe that we saw some very political reaction to, but what's the talk down there sort of as the chips have fallen?
I mean, I think there's this general sense of disbelief because, once again, a couple of days before McCabe announced that he was resigning, he and Christopher Wray said, look, we're not going anywhere. It's not up to the president to determine, to put political pressure and ask, an FBI deputy to step down. And the Trump administration and the Trump spokespeople continued to push and push and push and say that McCabe was polluted by Democrats and Democratic donors. And they seem to have gotten their way. The sense of disbelief is because it's just one more prong in a story about obstructing justice. I mean, if you're convinced that you have not done anything wrong and you have not obstructed justice, then why would you try to force out yet one more person who you really shouldn't be making a decision as to whether that person stays or not based on political grounds? And that's what the Trump administration has still done. So, I mean, he was going to leave eventually anyway, but the timing of it is certainly something that the Democrats will be able to use to continue to argue that this administration, and Donald Trump in particular, is willing to do anything to shut down this investigation or to pollute the findings and suggest that they're completely politically motivated.
And let's talk about the FBI. If you're McCabe, if you're a high-ranking FBI official, do you go into the bureau thinking that it could be a potentially very public role, if you will? There are those that say, oh, well, McCabe just didn't want to withstand the heat. You're not elected to the position, but do you think that the rank and file FBI, when they rise to the top, are ready to be under such scrutiny?
Not at all. And remember, the irony of all of this is that when Jim Comey actually went public, he was condemned, and Trump claimed that he was firing him in part because he was such a showboater and because he was trying to establish this personal appeal and communicate directly with the American people. So this is pretty unheard of, and it just demonstrates that no aspect of the United States federal government and no agency or department within justice are immune to political attacks at this point. The other thing to keep in mind, too, is as far as we know, the only thing that McCabe did wrong was marry a Democrat.
So let's move on to super partisan politics, if you will, here. The RNC and what transpired this week with Steve Wynn, the former finance chair for the RNC. The head of the RNC is saying not going to return donations from Steve Wynn at this point. What's the Wynn fallout?
Right, they're going to wait until he's convicted or until the investigation finishes, which to me, I've got to say, you've got to hand it to the Republicans, because notions of being hypocrites are not something that they consider, right? So they had no problem whatsoever demanding that Democratic candidates across the country, from the top of the ballot all the way down to local offices, return any money that had Harvey Weinstein's imprint on it at all whatsoever. Here, you've got the head of the RNC Finance Division charged with sexual harassment, and they're going to wait for the investigation to go through. But I think in part this is because their donors are not going to demand anything other than that. And so, the differences in the way the Democrats and the Republicans have responded to issues of sexual harassment are linked in part to how their constituents feel about these issues and the price that they think the perpetrators should ultimately pay.
And let's flip over to the Democratic side. We saw some news this week with Hillary Clinton and very old allegations of sexual harassment by a staffer of hers that she had indeed kept on. What about the ramifications there? Again, this is part of, the swept up in the Me Too movement, if you will. But what's the reaction been down there in terms of Hillary Clinton and this piece of news that we have learned this week?
Well, I think a broad sense of relief in that she's not the face of the Democratic Party, because that would generate some widespread problems, given that sexual harassment, Me Too, and the notion of women's empowerment is so much at the forefront of the Democratic Party's agenda. It's certainly an issue, and it's certainly a problem. And frankly, if the Trump campaign would have known about this in 2016, you can imagine that it would have been front and center, and he would have said, that she had absolutely no right whatsoever to make any claims that he wasn't good with women, when it wasn't only her husband now who had engaged in, sexual improprieties, but her own campaign advisors as well. So, I think there's this general sense that that's awful, and it's stunning that it hadn't come out sooner. But there is this political sigh of relief that, she's at least not the spokesperson or the candidate.
Is it a bit of a pitfall for her as she's on the speaker circuit, as heaven knows she would still love to be in consideration for the next go around? Is this going to be a detriment to Clinton moving forward?
I think it's probably a nail in the coffin. In part because it would already be a very tough road to hoe to make the case that she should be the nominee or that she should give this a third shot. But when she can't then even portray herself as an advocate for women and women's empowerment on a personal level, there's no question that policy-wise she has. But if we believe these allegations and that she was aware of them and sort of swept them under the rug, it's hard to see how you recover from that, especially when you've got women like Kirsten Gillibrand, who have been very, very outspoken advocates about this, against this behavior, probably interested in vying for the nomination.
Do you think this impacts her speaking ability? Will we see institutions or universities or see any backlash, or will she continue down that road unfettered?
I think it's probably unlikely that it will affect invitations, but I can imagine that she'll be asked about it. And my sense is that she's probably not going to be able to put this on the list of things that she would never speak about. But the reality is she still was the first woman to garner a major party's nomination. She broke history, and she's been an outspoken advocate for women, families, and children. So I'm not sure that this is going to end her speaking career or the imprint that she's placed on women in American history, but I do think it probably seals the deal for a future political career.
So let's move on to the both future of the Democratic Party as we look now to the State of the Union this evening. We'll get to Joe Kennedy after, but the Nancy Pelosi quote, when did she make that quote about if Trump doesn't burp, or what was the other?
Or if his nose doesn't run,
then it's a good
speech. So today, it was in the same speech where it was in the same set of remarks where she also said that if Democrats have any sense of wanting to walk out, they shouldn't walk in. So she does not want the speech to be one of explicit protest. She's told her members that if they feel like they cannot sit there, if he's too offensive, if the kinds of things that he's endorsed and said would be so appalling to their constituents that they could be held accountable for attending, then they should feel free not to attend, but that the venue itself is not a place for explicit disrespect. So we'll see what happens. We do know that the Democratic women are planning to wear black. Kellyanne Conway has already condemned them and said that it's pretty pathetic that this is how they're going to spend their time, that they're just interested in what they're wearing. And what are they doing, showing allegiance to the women who think that Harvey Weinstein shouldn't be in Hollywood, sort of missing the entire point. But, my sense is that the expectations for Trump are quite low, but the expectations for Democratic bad behavior are quite high. So the Democrats need to sort of, demonstrate a sense of respect that the Republicans don't always demonstrate. And Donald Trump has to be able to read from a teleprompter.
And so what are the expectations coming from President Trump this evening? Do we expect him to take bold stances, or do we think it's going to be a safe speech?
Well, he announced today, his office announced today that he's going to have some extraordinary comments about North Korea. Now, we also know that that office is one that really engages in hyperbole on a pretty regular basis. So it's unclear if those comments will be completely new or something that we've never heard of. But, I don't expect that he'll be making new policy, but I do think there will probably be some zingers in there, similar to the inauguration speech, that highlight that he is setting a tone for this country that's a little bit different than what we're accustomed to. His office initially said that it was going to be a speech about unity, but given that he has said that he's planning on releasing the classified memo and that he believes, and he continues to believe, that the investigation is tainted, I think it's hard to believe that he's going to be able to unify anybody tonight.
Question for you, Professor Lawless. Where are you watching the State of the Union?
I'm watching the State of the Union in the privacy of my own home.
No big watching parties. And of course, one of the big events following the State of the Union is the Democratic response. The opposite party's response to this, Joe Kennedy III. Is this, are they kind of appointing him perhaps sort of the future flag bearer of the Democratic Party?
Well, I have two things to say. First, remember that delivering this response is a very, very difficult thing to do. And in many cases, it winds up sinking somebody's future career.
The curse,
right?
Yes. We've seen the curse.
Right. There is the curse of the response. And so, but I do think that the Democrats are sort of walking a fine line here because they want to demonstrate that they have new young blood and energy and a next generation of people who are, excellent orators, but also can inspire the population more broadly. And there's nothing to suggest that Joe Kennedy can't do that. The opposite side, though, is that his last name is Kennedy. And if we're talking about a brand new generation, it's a little bit difficult to make that case when you're talking about, a third generation of Kennedys. So we'll see what happens on that front. But I do think he's probably going to portray himself as a little bit more of a populist and a little bit less of a patrician.
I'm sure you've seen that SNL skit that was not too long ago about the new face of the Democratic Party, and it was sort of Pelosi and more of the same. So to see Kennedy, well, it'll be very interesting to see, and as you mentioned, the potential curse of the response to the State of the Union. But just want to touch upon, before we let you go, Jennifer, you're always quoted around the country for your research, and the recent one with NBC, taking a look and comparing women's involvement in politics in 2018, going back to 92 and Anita Hill and the tenor of the land back then, and you drew some parallels.
Yeah, 1992 was the year of the woman where we saw an unprecedented uptick in the number of women running for the House and the Senate, in large part because they were disgusted by the way that the all-male Senate Judiciary Committee treated Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. And notions of sexual harassment and the inability of Congress to deal with that motivated a lot of these women's candidacies. And we're seeing this time around very similar motivations. And because women now are graduating from law schools at higher rates, are getting MBAs at unprecedented numbers, are working in politics, the uptick involves not an extra 100 women, but several hundred additional women seeking office. And so, I think we're well situated to see a year of the woman based on a lot of the same factors that we thought we had addressed 25 years ago. The one caveat I'd caution, though, is that, there's still a very substantial gender gap in political ambition where women are less likely than men to be interested in running. So ideas like, sexual harassment is going to close that gender gap really don't pan out. But when you have sexual harassment at the forefront, it is enough to inspire a few hundred women to throw their hats into the ring. And given that women are so underrepresented in the first place, it's enough to really change their percentages in our national legislature. So, we'll see what happens, but the numbers now suggest that we're well on our way to a pretty substantial increase.
Another year of the woman. Well, Jennifer Lawless, as always, appreciate your taking the time to Skype in. I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about next week after the State of the Union, seeing if we see this memo and plenty more coming from D.C. Thanks, Jennifer.
My pleasure. Okay. Bye-bye.
Jennifer Lawless, down at American University, just recently quoted in NBC News for her research on women running for office back